Welcome back. Let's go back to one of our top stories. The Commission for Gender Equality says victims of gender-based violence face secondary victimizations at shelters, which should be their safety nets. Now, the Commission has released a report in Johannesburg on the state of shelters in South Africa. Some of the findings of the report include a lack of counselling when victims arrive at the shelters. The Commission further states that there's inadequate funding for shelters and there are late payments for such facilities. The Commission wants the Social Development Department to address the deep-rooted challenges at the shelters. Our reporter Maageketla Mohlabe joins us now live from Constitution Hill, where the report was released just a short while ago. Hey Maageketla, thank you very much indeed for coming back to us. So from the findings, you were saying that what are some of the other challenges facing shelters in the country?
Well, good morning to you again, Blaine. Apologies for that technical glitch there. And of course, as the chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality, you're still explaining in terms of how they actually came about this particular report, more especially detailing that they actually assembled 3 shelters in each of these 9 provinces. And of course, they looked at a shelter, for example, that was 100% fully funded by the government, one that was partially funded, and one that was not funded at all, perhaps depending on donation. But obviously, she's joining me now, Blaine, just to actually take us through this particular report. It's a detailed report, and we know that is actually talking about the issue of shelters in the country. Just tell us, why did you then decide to actually go for 3 categories of these shelters in each of these provinces?
We decided to do 3 categories because we realized that category 1 was the shelters that were fully funded by the Department of Social Development, and the second category was a category of a shelter that was partially funded, and the last category was a category of a shelter that was not receiving funding at all from government or even from an external source of funding. And then we decided that we will look at how they are providing a package of services in all these 3 categories of shelters in the country. And what we realized was that the main issue for all the 3 categories was the lack of or inadequate funding for the shelters to provide minimum standard services across the board. And we realized that even the services themselves were not standardized, and so people were actually providing service based on the needs of a particular woman who comes in requesting some kind of a shelter, running away from a perpetrator, running away from a home where there is a possibility that that woman might actually face some kind of killing or femicide.
And now, what is of huge concern is here is that, it sounds like at some particular time or period of time of stay at these particular shelters, in which then they would be requested to go back home, probably go back to where they actually experienced this abuse. And I heard you mention that some are then forced to go into the streets.
When we interviewed the shelter managers, most of them actually gave us information that the time period for stay was that there was no minimum time. Some would actually be admitted for a day or 2, depending on the need. But the maximum time that they can stay in the shelter was a period of 6 months, of which after 6 months, the victim or survivor of gender-based violence had to be discharged. Our major concern as the Commission for Gender Equality was that these women would be discharged after a period of 6 months to go back to a community or to go back to a home or to go back to a perpetrator. And that actually concerned us because some of the women were complaining that their homes were not ready to receive them and they would rather go back to the streets rather than going back to homes. So that was a major concern with regards to timing of the exiting of the shelter, actual exiting of the shelter itself.
And this issue of funding also affects members of the LGBTIQ communities, isn't it?
Yes. We discovered that the shelters themselves did not provide for the members of the LGBTIQA communities and also people living with disabilities. For an example, if you look at the infrastructure itself, there were no ramps for people who were on wheelchair, and again, there were no rooms or separate rooms for people who are gender non-conforming people, who are neither man or woman. So you will find that for that particular kind of a person, it was very difficult to actually be integrated into the bigger scheme of women who were admitted into one big room and not accommodating members of LGBTIQA communities. And these are some of the recommendations that we are making to say, listen, in South Africa, I think the Constitution actually allows for members to actually have access and freedoms in wherever shelters or housing that they can access. So members of LGBTIQA communities are not actually accommodated in the centers, and should they be accommodated, they face discrimination on a daily basis in the shelters in South Africa.
Overall, I mean, I think then it speaks to the issue of the dignity, the dignity of the people that we are talking about here, and of course their right to have actually freedom in the country. What are the recommendations, and to whom are these recommendations addressing?
We will address the recommendations with regards to the Constitution and what's enshrined in the Constitutions with regards to rights of women and people living with disabilities and LGBTIQA communities. The very same Constitution talks about the right to dignity and the right to privacy. So we will definitely make those recommendations with regards to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, to the shelters themselves, but also to the Department of Social Development, the Department of Human Settlement, and other departments that are more likely to be integrated or to be invited to make sure that they look at the broader issues of the shelters and make sure that we encourage the shelters, or we recommend the shelters to partner with some of the institutions and work closely with them so that some of the key issues are addressed. For an example, one of the issues was around training and providing a minimum package of services to the shelter or to the victims of violence themselves. So we will invite and recommend that the shelters must partner with some of the departments that can actually provide training and capacity building and empower those women to be able to leave the shelters having been empowered to face the world on their own.
And of course, I understand that you've now called on the Director Generals from the Human Settlements, as well as which department is Social Department, Social Development Department, to actually come and account. When are we expecting them to actually come and sit here and speak to you about these issues?
We have a schedule, and we will be writing out the letters that are inviting the heads of the department to come and appear before the Commission, and we are expecting that the heads of the department, particularly the DG, the Director General of the Department of Social Development, at a national level, to come and appear to the Commission, as well as the heads of department in provinces to come and appear before the Commission within the next period of 3 to 6 months. And we will make sure that in that hearing we also do allow them a space to actually respond to the investigative findings that we have, as well as recommendations that we have. So that will actually assist us to substantiate information to make sure that our report gets information that comes from the department in terms of what have they been doing with the shelters and the victims of violence all along. And then from there, we will actually be making a new, fresh ideas or recommendations to the DGs themselves, and then we will be giving them tighter time frames in terms of delivering on the recommendations that we will together agree upon.
Thanks so much for your time. And of course, that's the acting chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality, telling us that these are some of the findings that actually found in terms of this particular investigation. And of course, they are calling on government departments to actually take charge in terms of providing services for these people who are actually running away from their families or from their communities because of gender-based violence. Blaine, and I have to mention that I guess this is going to be some sort of a test to say that if this country really takes seriously the issue of gender-based violence, more especially violence against women and children, then they will have to foot up the bill. They need to actually allocate funds to actually get these shelters running, more especially in communities that we know that really need assistance, more especially when it comes to finances.
It is indeed an important report in order to put forward solutions, in order to obviate some of the challenges facing these shelters in South Africa. Maageketla Mohlabe, thank you very much indeed for your reporting.